This is Lesson 1, Week 1 of 52. We're going to look at Genesis 3 through 11 and Job 1 and 2 in our Through the Bible in 1 Year study. Last time we looked at the 6 days of creation, man's test, failure, and means of redemption, and expulsion from paradise. So they were banished from paradise. Adam and Eve still had a very long life to live. In Adam's case, a total of 930 years, Genesis 5:5. And the first thing God did was to give them children to propagate the earth. And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived, and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Genesis 4:1. Eve believed her firstborn was the promised Redeemer, mentioned in Genesis 3:15, but she was wrong. Adam and Eve had another son, Abel. Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Genesis 4:2. What have we learned of the ground so far? Cursed is the ground for thy sake. Genesis 3:17. But out of an animal God had sacrificed and clothed them in his righteousness. Genesis 3:21. These two sons of Adam and Eve were very different. One was godly and one wasn't. By faith, Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. Hebrews 11:4. Abel's a bloody sacrifice. Cain's a bloodless one. Why? Cain rebelled and followed the leading of Satan. Not as Cain, who was of that wicked one, and slew his brother. And wherefore slew he him? Because his own works were evil, and his brother's righteous. 1 John 3:12. Adam and Eve had another son, Seth, who became the lineage of Christ. Whereas Adam had been made in the image of God, Genesis 5:1, Seth was born in the fallen image of his father, Adam, as has every person born since. About 2400 BC, God destroyed the earth and everything in it with water. Why? And God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. The world had gone in the way of Cain. How grieved was God with the rebellion of mankind? And it repented. God was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. Genesis 6:6. That is, all except for Noah. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis 6:8. Why? By faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house. Hebrews 11:7. Noah believed God. He had faith. When told a flood was coming, which he kept not just to himself, but spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. 2 Peter 2:5. How many converts did Noah get with his preaching? Not many. His wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. How long did Noah preach? Yet his, man's days, on the earth shall be 120 years. Genesis 6:3. God would give mankind 120 years to accept his offer of safety in the ark, the time it took Noah and his sons to build the ark. And then the rains came. The facts. It rained 40 days and nights. Genesis 7:4. There was water on the earth 150 days. 7:24. The water took another 150 days to recede. 8:3. They got off the ark in 377 days, 1 year and 17 days. 8:19. Guess what was the first thing Noah did after the ark landed on dry ground? And Noah built an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast, and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Genesis 8:20. As a result, God promised, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Genesis 8:21. God knew he couldn't destroy the earth every time man rebelled. He would come up with a different course of action. And God blessed Noah and his sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, and said unto them, Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. Genesis 9:1. Noah's sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, would be the beginning of the Gentiles divided in their lands, in their nations. Genesis 10:5. But it would not start well. And Noah began to be a husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and he was drunken, and he was uncovered in his tent. Genesis 9:20 and 21. Ham dishonored his father by looking at his nakedness. The other 2 boys shielded themselves from seeing him. Genesis 9:22 and 23. And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done to him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. Genesis 9:24 and 25. The curse didn't fall on Ham, but on his son Canaan, because God knew the future. How? When? Canaan and his descendants would inhabit a land not given to them of God, but given to Shem and his descendants of Abraham. The Canaanites would show the same ungodly, pagan, and immoral behavior as did Ham when he looked upon his father. As a result, God gave them sufficient time to leave, more than 400 years, Genesis 15:16. But if they refused to go, they were to be driven from their land. If they refused to be driven from their land, they were to be put to death. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Genesis 11:1 and 2. Instead of spreading out and forming Gentile nations, as God had commanded, they congregated in one place. And they said one to another, "Let us build us a city, a single nation of people, and a tower whose top may reach into heaven." Genesis 11:3 and 4. Instead of worshiping Noah's God, they built a tower to reach the gods of their evil imaginations. Let us make us a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Genesis 11:4b. Instead of praising the name of God, they followed Satan and his desire to have them praise themselves instead of God. And the Lord God came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. Behold, the people is one. Now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Genesis 11, verses 5 and 6. God knew he had to do something, or else things would be exactly as they were before the flood. Let us go down there, confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Genesis 11, verse 7. He confounded their language so that they were forced to stop construction. Eventually, they dispersed, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Genesis 11:9. But their rebellion did not end. Their rebellion against God went with them all over the earth. The rebellion that began at the Tower of Babel was the beginning of a worldwide Satan-induced practice of idolatry that began with one man. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth, and the beginning of his, or Satan's kingdom, was Babel. Genesis 10, verses 8 and 10. The Apostle Paul cited this fact, "For the mystery of iniquity doth already work." 2 Thessalonians 2:7. Not only does Satan's rebellion continue in the world today, but it will culminate in a yet future day. Then shall that wicked one be revealed. 2 Thessalonians 2:8. Satan's influence in the world that began at Babel will culminate when the Antichrist manifests himself at the halfway point of the tribulation, so that he, the Antichrist, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. 2 Thessalonians 2:4. After God created man at about 4000 BC, it took mankind 1600 years to rebel against God before he destroyed them with a flood at about 2400 BC. It took less than 400 years after the flood to have the whole human race rebel against God a second time. The descendants of Noah formed unholy nations after their own name. What would God do now? God would search the world until he found the right man through whom he would form a holy nation after his name. That man would be Abraham. Genesis 11:25-27. Sorry, wrong Abraham. But before that, we are going to look at the beginning of the study of the book of Job. Why the book of Job now in this study? Because we are studying the Bible chronologically, and Job is believed to have lived before God's call of Abraham. The book of Job is considered wisdom literature like Psalms, which is a praise book, Proverbs, divine wisdom, Ecclesiastes, life, and the Song of Solomon, marriage. The overriding theme of Job is suffering. Why does a book belong in the Bible that records the seemingly undeserved suffering of a righteous man who loses his material wealth, children, and health, whose wife tells him to curse God and die, whose friends condemn rather than console him, and to whom God appears to turn a deaf ear? Good question. For our study, though written in antiquity, this story is still relevant today. Job's predicament often mirrors situations we find ourselves today, financially, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. He seems alone in his despair, and it seems Satan is attacking and God is nowhere to be found. Like Job, we often ask why life is so unfair, why bad things happen to good people who are trying their best to live a godly life. We know we should not curse God, but is it wrong to question God and his doings? But should we demand anything of God? This book will help us to answer these and many other questions. The author is unknown. Some believe it to be Job himself, Elihu, the fourth friend, Moses, Solomon, Hezekiah, Isaiah, Ezra, or an eyewitness to the story of Job. Job lived 140 years after being restored to good health, which would have allowed plenty of time for the events to be recorded by inspiration for future canonization. The date Job lived is unknown, though most scholars believe it was slightly before the patriarchal period, which began in about 2000 BC. Most likely, Job lived at about 2200 BC. Then came Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the great patriarchs of Israel. The reason is that Job lived 140 years after these events happened. He would have most likely lived over 200 years, which corresponds to the lifespans of others during that time. Noah lived 950 years, but those coming after began to decrease. Abraham lived 175 years, Isaac 180 years, Jacob 147 years, according to the scriptures. Another indication that Job's life took place in the post-flood patriarchal period is that his wealth was accrued in livestock. which was the same for Abraham and Jacob. There are no references to the Mosaic law, holy days, or the tabernacle. Therefore, Job must have lived before the giving of the law. Job was a common second millennial BC Semitic name. Job lived in the land of Uz, which scholars believe predated and was then conquered by Edom, who was the descendants of Esau, being directly west across the Arabian desert from Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham was from. Job is believed to be the oldest of the canonized scriptures. The first 5 books of the Bible, or the Pentateuch, were written by Moses during his lifetime, or about 1500 BC. Therefore, he had to write by the inspiration of God, not by eyewitness. It is believed that Job was written at the time the events took place during his lifetime, at about 2200 BC, which would have been 700 years before Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, making it the oldest. The book of Job begins with one of the oldest and most important lessons in the Bible, yet is one of the most important today, the righteousness of man. Genesis 1 described creation of mankind. Genesis 3, the fall and banishment from Eden. Genesis 4 shows the mercy of God as he pointed man back to God. One accepted, Abel. One rejected, Cain. Abel's was God's way. Cain's was man's way. Prior to the flood, the overwhelming majority elected to follow Cain's way, few God's way. After the flood and the Tower of Babel, that rebellion continued. In the book of Job, we pick up the same theme, a righteous man living in an evil world. Job had a large family, considered to be a divine blessing at that time. Job was the greatest of all men in the East and incredibly wealthy. Job was the most influential and respected person in that area. Job offered burnt offerings for his rebellious children. He was a beacon of light in an otherwise dark world with his endurance and perseverance through suffering. The reader also should not be ignorant of God's importance or his intended end, that his mercy and compassion toward mankind is the ultimate lesson taught. One day angels came to appear before God, and Satan came along. We see that Satan had access to heaven. God speaks to Satan, and Satan answers. God points out the virtue of Job, but Satan answered God, pointing an accusing finger toward Job. Satan doesn't refute the fact that Job is a righteous man, but implies that Job is following God not because of pure motives, that he really loves him, but rather only for what he receives from God. Satan contends that God has insulated Job from anything but good, that as long as Job continues to do good, he will be further blessed. Satan's accusation is that Job's faith is really based on a self-serving, less than holy intent. A sub-theme of Job is the inner motive of the believer. Why do we become believers? Is it simply a means to an end? Is it only to get to heaven or to escape hell? Or is it because we really love God and want to live our life for Him in this life and in the one to come? And then Satan challenges God concerning Job. Was Job blessed because he loved God, or did he love God because he was blessed? Satan was betting that Job loved God because of the blessings he received from God, and if those things were taken away, Job's faith would quickly fade. This accusation was also an indictment against God. Satan reckoned that the only way God can get man to follow him is for them to get something in return. Satan reasoned that if God were to remove material gain, man would quickly lose interest in God. God allowed Satan to take anything but Job's life. Job 1:12. The stage is set for the remainder of the book. Will Job continue to trust God if he loses everything but his life? God says he is mine, and Satan believes he can draw Job away from God. Next time, Satan attacks Job. We're going to look at Job from the first chapter, the 12th verse, all the way to chapter 40.